I thank Dr. Franzen for this kind introduction. It's a pleasure to be here addressing so challenging an audience. But since I have only a short time, I must plunge directly into the matter at hand. I apologize for not speaking German. Unfortunately, my education was lacking in that respect. I shall argue tonight that historical forces of varying sizes and timescales have combined to create what appears to be a sudden crisis in the nature of expert knowledge. While some of these forces are new, others are quite old. As a result, their conjuncture is difficult to interpret. By cataloging these forces carefully and specifying their counterpoint with one another, I aim at a serious analysis of the general phenomenon. Those of you who know my work will recognize my usual strategy, which is to make a perceptual argument. I shall decompose the present into the intersection of several different processes having varying temporal character, and I will then use that decomposition to propose possible points of intervention. The first section, however, is an important caveat. I am not going to talk about any current revolution in knowledge, because there is no current revolution in knowledge. The idea that we are in a particularly revolutionary period is an ideology of various groups in the knowledge world at this moment, groups that wish to stampede or force others into supporting their particular recipe for the future, a recipe which has little to do with knowledge and much to do with capitalism. Within academia itself, the mania for innovation, creativity, and excellence derives from the mechanical and inappropriate application of management ideologies to intellectual life. To be sure, technological advance is extraordinarily rapid at the moment, but the advance of basic science is much slower. In field after field, we are today living off the basic science of the past, filling in the footnotes and deriving the technological implications of theories like quantum mechanics, plate tectonics, the new evolutionary synthesis, and cultural relativism, all of which date from the first half of the 20th century. In my view, there has been no recent advance in basic research that compares with the discoveries of the period from 1870 to 1950. Nor is technological change actually much faster than in the past. In broadcast media, in personal communications, and in expert knowledge practices, there have been revolutions with monotonous regularity since the Napoleonic era. Let me review the record for English language sources alone. In broadcast media, there were the new elite reviews in the 1820s, circulating libraries in the 1850s, mass literacy, dime novels and newspapers in the 1880s, radio in the 1920s, television in the 1950s, and the internet in the 1990s. In personal communications, there were the penny post and telegraph in the 1880s, the telephone in the 1890s, universal telephone service and mass long-distance telephony in the 1950s, cell phones by the 1980s, and packet data cell service in the 2000s. As for knowledge tools, the mid-19th century saw rapid expansion of periodicals, abstracting, and indexing. The late 19th century brought subject-classified libraries, the Hollerith punched card technology, modern academic specialties, and crowdsourced expert projects like the Oxford English Dictionary. The early 20th century brought national library catalogs and comprehensive periodical collection data. The 1930s brought inferential statistics. The 1940s brought programmable computers, microfilm, and computerized concordance indexes. The 1970s brought keyword indexing, the 1980s brought computer searchable reference tools, and the 2000s brought mass distribution of periodicals and of Google Scholar. In summary, broadcast communications, personal communications, and expert knowledge tools have developed so rapidly that in no time in the last 200 years could a knowledge expert possibly have lived a full career without experiencing one or more revolutions in all three of these areas. Our experience today is not in the least unusual. Now, to be sure, scholars from all epochs in the past have felt that their revolutions were the most revolutionary ever. But this could be true only if the changes were exponential, with ever-increasing slopes. And of course, one can easily produce apparent statistical evidence of this exponentiality by counting things like numbers of books published, numbers of articles written, numbers of internet conversations. But these counts are completely meaningless. Thus, for example, the books we publish today are much less likely to be read than were the books of our teachers. Our articles contain work that no one would have bothered to publish 50 years ago. And our internet conversations are simply replacing conversations that used to take place in the corridor. Under conditions of continuous transformation, counting such previous units of analysis will always show exponential expansion. But that expansion is made meaningless by the very tools that have turned earlier grand achievements into commodified simplicities today. For many of us, canned statistical programs are the most obvious example of this destructive force of commodification. They have created not more science, but more foolishness. In short, today's explosion of publishing means nothing whatsoever in terms of real intellectual achievement. Now, why we all believe in this mirage of achievement is an interesting topic, but it must wait for another talk. Here, I will rather discuss the larger flows in our expert knowledge and show how these are cross-cut by cyclical patterns and one-time changes, producing the strange conjuncture that we face today. So that was the first bit, no revolution. Second bit, what are the long flows of change? I shall consider first the long-term changes under four basic headings: the objects of knowing, the subjects of knowing, the results of knowing, and the activities of knowing. Objects, subjects, results, activities. I choose this non-Kantian order because the most important of these four is not knowledge, but knowing. We define excellent knowledge as whatever it is that is produced by excellent knowing. We do not define excellent knowing as whatever kind of knowing it is that produces knowledge that seems excellent to non-experts. And surely the assertion that knowing defines knowledge, rather than the other way around, is an assertion I do not need to defend in the land of Immanuel Kant, Wilhelm von Humboldt, and Leopold von Ranke. So to begin with the objects of knowing, what is known? Two major changes seem central in the last half-century. The first is a shift from a content of knowledge that is mainly about the natural world to one that is equally or more detailed, but about the social world. Now, of course, the history of social knowledge, of censuses and tax rolls is a long one, but truly effective censuses and taxing systems are creations of the 19th and 20th centuries. Perhaps more important, the massive expansion of economies from the late 19th century onward has been completed by an equally massive expansion in financial records, and the subsequent expansion of the welfare state required a similarly massive expansion in knowledge about welfare recipients. Moreover, the second half of the 20th century brought the expansion of consumer credit and of a cashless consumption system based on continuously collected information about financial transfers. While much of this data was always passively collected, we now have the computer memories and algorithmic means to process it. In conclusion, to a large extent, it is now ourselves that we know. The second great change is related to this one, as I shall argue at more length shortly. Our desire to know more and more has led us to a perpetual pursuit of shortcuts to knowing, most especially to the creation of commodities that can know things for us: summaries, guidebooks, calculators, expert systems, and so on. But as we invent these new commodities, we simply increase our desire for detail. This ratchet mechanism results in a steady increase in the detail and particularity of the total of things that are in some sense known. Now, to be sure, there has always been cognitive overload. The great Renaissance humanists wrote hundreds of thousands of letters, after all. But there is an immense increase in the detail of what we know about certain objects of knowledge, which results in the increasing decomposition of those very objects into smaller and smaller objects. Thus, the two great changes in the object of our knowledge are first that it is much more ourselves and our social life that we know. And the second, that the race between desire for knowledge and commodification of knowledge steadily decomposes the objects of our knowledge into smaller and smaller objects. Now, these changes in the things that we know, the object of knowing, have been complemented by changes in the subject of knowing, the knower, who knows. There are three important trends here. The first is the rise of what I shall call the social knower. In the 19th century, expert knowledge was artisanal. There were scholarly societies, but they met seldom. Even in the most advanced countries, there were only a handful of great libraries, a few major museums, a few research hospitals, and perhaps half a dozen non-university research institutions. Scholars worked mainly alone. The 20th century knower became much more social. In part, this reflected the advancing numbers of corporate research institutions. The growth of industrial laboratories and the university's adoption of the departmental structure brought intensive substantive discussion into everyday scholarly life. Collaborative work consequently spread through the sciences, other than mathematics, by the mid-20th century, and even into the social sciences as well. In the humanities and the humanistic social sciences, this socializing of the knower has happened more slowly. But even in these most artisanal of fields, there emerged in the 20th century the diffuse organizational form known as the discipline, which linked researchers in loose communities quite unlike the large research organization with its formal division of labor and its linear operating structure. But the disciplinary form is a social form, nonetheless. An important correlative trend is the increasing dominance of social knowing among our students, at least in the United States. Students increasingly prefer group-based and supportive learning environments over individualistic and competitive ones. This phenomenon parallels the changes in the expert knowledge world. Perhaps more important, demographic succession will eventually spread it throughout the academic community. Now, although this trend seems new, it is worth remembering that John Dewey promoted social knowing very, very strongly in the beginning of the 20th century, and yet the culture drew back from that towards tracking excellence, individualism, and competition in the 1950s. So there may be a cyclical quality to this first aspect of change in the subject of knowledge, the rise of the social knower. Now, the second great change in the knower is the emergence of organizations as subjects of knowledge, as things that know things. In the professions, for example, solo practice has drastically declined. Professional life is dominated by large, usually multi-professional organizations, the medical center, the architectural and design firm, the accountancy and consulting firm. Applied social research is similarly the province of interdisciplinary teams of economists, physicians, nurses, social workers, sociologists, and so on. The forms of knowledge are actually encoded into the divisions of labor in such organizations, and thus the organizations themselves are knowers as much as are the professionals within them. The modern hospital illustrates this phenomenon through its complex structuring of care, which is familiar to anyone who has experienced the Kafkaesque world of modern medicine. Such organizational knowers often claim to own the knowledge of their workers, as is evident in contract clauses which enjoin non-competition on engineers who resign from a firm while they're in possession of what the firm calls proprietary knowledge. But if much of the knowledge of the modern world actually resides implicitly in the routines, techniques, and divisions of labor of knowledge organizations, even more of it resides in commodities. This is indeed the third great change in the modern knower. It is more often a thing than a person. Like several of the other trends discussed earlier, commodification of knowledge has been common for at least 2 centuries. The stethoscope was once an advanced medical tool reserved for physicians. Now practical nurses use it. Students no longer memorize arithmetic tables, they push buttons on calculators. Engineers no longer puzzle over difficult integrals, they use numerical approximators instead. Indeed, the 20th century has brought entire systems of commodity expertise. Inferential statistics were commodified into formulas usable by novices within 20 years of their discovery in the 1920s. And by the 1970s, they were embodied in computer programs that made them easily accessible to people who were completely ignorant of the mathematics that justifies them. There are thus three great changes in the knower to complement the two in the known. The rise of the social knower, which, as I've said, may be cyclical, but seems currently on the upswing. The rise of organizations of as knowers, which is steadily increasing since World War II, and the increasing importance of things as knowers, which has been a steady trend for at least 200 years. As for knowledge itself, I move on now to knowledge itself, the result of knowing. There's one major change, a change not in the quantity of things known, but rather in their character. Knowledge is increasingly commodity-like. It's not a process, but a result. Now, part of this change arises from the use of the word knowledge to denote the vast quantities of random facts that our society collects, which can now be turned into valuable information by algorithms that can squeeze meaningful results from jumbled masses of near randomness. This value potential inherent in any data, no matter how seemingly unimportant, turns all data into potential knowledge and therefore imports to knowledge itself the commodity quality that's usually associated only with data. But the more obvious sources for the knowledge as commodity concept are the commercial and educational worlds. In the commercial world itself, there is literal commodification, the increasing attempt of capitalists to make knowledge into private property. When they cannot own knowledge itself, they charge monopoly rents for access to it, even though the knowledge involved, in the centrally important case of existing scholarship, was built by the communal efforts of generations of scholars as a free common resource. Now, that knowledge is by its nature common property has not bothered the capitalists in their attempt to turn it into an ownable thing. They would copyright interpretations of the Critique of Pure Reason if they could figure out a way to do so. The educational world also drives commodification. Commodification in education has a long history. Cramming and teaching to the test were characteristic of 19th century Oxford. More generally, it's more easy, more replicable, and possibly more fair to test commodity content rather than to test reasoning powers. And this fact has driven intensive commodification in the testing side of education. The pressures inherent in testing have been paralleled by the extreme commodification in textbooks, which for at least the last 40 years have in the United States been mainly designed by publishers' marketing departments and have a purely commodity organization. As a result, even the finest students in an immense country like mine enter university with the notion that they will learn in the university not skills of knowing, but rather a particular substantive content. Thus, the drift toward knowledge as commodity has deep roots in the economic system, the educational system, and increasingly in the students themselves. The most dangerous aspect of this drift is its self-validating quality. Because of the steady rise of commodity knowledge noted earlier, there often arise techniques that can automate some large portion of earlier knowledge production, producing output that, judged by earlier criteria, is perhaps only 80 or 90% as good as it was before. But the automated technique then swamps the world with its second-rate products, and people come to believe that whatever it is that the technique produces is knowledge. Think about Wordles. That is, by sheer overproduction, the new product becomes the paradigm of knowledge, and contact is lost with other and pre-existing scales, on the basis of which this new product is actually not excellent at all. Again, canned statistical programs are an excellent example. Widely available statistical packages enable people with little understanding of the mathematics, the assumptions, and the validity issues of statistical inference to write articles that appear successfully to use quite elaborate statistical analysis. In fact, the results are usually nonsense. That's my experience from 15 years editing the American Journal of Sociology. But they look like knowledge And so inevitably they lead to the redefinition of what knowledge is. Most of digital humanities is another lugubrious lesson in such scholarly futility, based as it is on data mining techniques with far less stability than the simplicities of multiple regression. Let me turn now to changes in knowing as an activity, my fourth area. In telling the story of commodified statistics, I have already drifted into my fourth area of interest, that of knowing. Now, the place where I myself confront changes in knowing most clearly is among first-year students in our college, since every year I teach introductory social thought to a small class of 18 and 19-year-olds. That's what U.S. universities do. They put the distinguished service professors teaching beginning students. Bear in mind that I teach at one of the best universities in the world and that our undergraduates are among the very best students in the United States. Now, for the most part, the students that I teach think that knowing something is knowing a web address, a URL. That is, their chief model of knowing is finding, since they've been doing that on the internet considerably longer than they have been at school. They define reading itself as a kind of finding. That is, for them, reading Adam Smith means looking for the 5 or 6 sentences in each chapter that really matter. They don't understand that the rest of the sentences Adam Smith wrote contain the argument and the evidence by which he produces and defends the sentences that they have underlined. For them, reading is simply surfing something other than the internet. It is an exercise in filtering out the irrelevancies and finding out what really matters. They simply do not believe that all that other stuff is necessary. They do not, in fact, actually believe in thought. They believe in bits of content. Now, this model of knowing as finding is, of course, correlative with the notion that knowledge consists of commodities, because commodities are things that can be found. And typically, since their model of finding dates from early childhood, our students imagine that what there is to be found is facts, content, discrete bits of information. Whatever they seek, whether it's the interpretation of Pride and Prejudice, the ideas of Karl Marx, or the essence of Gothic architecture, they will think of it as a fact, a commodity. Their idea of knowing does not include any notion of real argument. If I ask these students for Adam Smith's argument, they give me a list of bullet points. All the items on that list will be things that Adam Smith said. They will even be important things that Adam Smith said. But there will be no logical connection between them because the students do not really think of an argument as a complex logical syntax. They think of it as a list. Now, the conceptions of knowing as finding and of argument as list clearly arise in the fact that the first intellectual experiences of students are with the internet. Argument is impoverished there. It's well known that internet pages are optimized at 6th grade language levels. And the medium itself conduces to the idea that knowing is finding and that lists are the main architecture of knowing. As long as the internet remains children's first intellectual food, then, we can expect to have to teach discursive reasoning quite explicitly. Unlike us, they will not learn the skills of real thought passively from reading tens of thousands of pages of prose as youngsters. They don't actually read that much. Now, the ideas of knowing as finding and of argument as list are parts of a larger pattern. Our children think of knowing as strongly algorithmic. This is not because they genuinely understand the nature of the metropolis or the householder or the Needleman-Wunsch algorithm. It is because, for example, they grew up using calculators rather than memorizing multiplication tables. That is, they grew up with commodity aids for thinking rather than having to remember things and to think for themselves. This algorithmic model of knowing means that they have no sense of the other principal way of knowing, which I shall call associative knowing, since it involves associating things with each other. Now, to have effective associative knowing, your head must be full of knowledge to associate the new things you see with facts and notions and memories and arguments that function like so many little hooks that grab into things in the texts that pass in front of you. But our students are unwilling to memorize actual knowledge since they devoutly believe that they can find anything when they need it. forgetting that it takes time and search to do that. This is not to say that they don't know anything, quite the contrary. They spend their leisure hours trolling the internet and have filled their minds with evanescent information, most of it about consumption goods and about their friends' recent behaviors, clothing, and random thoughts. They refresh, that is, they erase, those memories rapidly and are very proud of doing so. It's what makes them au courant. They are thus not actually prepared to function as associative minds. An entire continent of knowing is simply invisible to them. Interestingly, this preference for algorithmic as opposed to associative knowing among young people is echoed by a great change in knowing among adults. In the commercial world, in governments, and even in a surprising amount of academia, there is a strong notion today that there is basically one kind of knowing, which is more or less that of modern science, not indeed as it is actually practiced in laboratories, but in the rigid caricature of scientific thinking represented by Percy Bridgman's operationalism, biological positivism, and by the American version of scientific philosophy by Morris Cohen and Ernst Nagel. This partially explains the drift of the humanists towards the silliness of digital humanities, taking a scientific approach to forms of knowledge that are in principle unscientific. Another excellent illustration of this kind of scientization is the transformation of the discipline of economics from a general and quite profound reflection about the nature of human production, consumption, and exchange into a narrow form of social engineering obsessed not only with discovering, or rather enforcing, the laws of a very particular kind of economy, but also with teaching those laws as scientific truth to tens of millions of defenseless students annually. A back-of-the-envelope calculation gives us the astounding fact that around $50 billion are spent every year on the teaching of economics in the United States. 50 billion. And if you want to think about the real intellectual distinction of economics today, just ask yourself whether Joseph Schumpeter could get a job in a current economics department. Every economist I have ever asked that question says that he could not, and most of them are honest enough to admit that this is a sign of intellectual crisis. Now, much of this one-size-fits-all approach to knowledge has been driven by the capture of the social sciences by the governmental task of evaluating the successes and failures of the welfare state, a task which has pushed the social sciences themselves towards a narrow operationalism. Important also has been the suicide of the humanities, which, at least in the United States, have largely degenerated from broad inquiries into the nature of human culture into eager propositions of a well-meant but often silly identity politics, a politics which is itself of an intellectual structure and simplicity that was rejected by the social sciences many decades ago. The ultimate symbol of this surrender to a one-size-fits-all form of knowing is the emergence of Google as a major site of scholarship. Now, interestingly, the Google project long antedates the internet. By the 1920s, the leaders of world librarianship had conceived the idea of a universal library with a master index, the core idea of Google today. Now, the scholars of 20th century America rejected that concept absolutely and pursued highly particularistic and associative indexing of a kind that we now know from Bayesian theory is both more useful and, in fact, more mathematically modern than are the librarians and Google's indexes from nowhere. The same thing happened with keyword indexes, which emerged as a scholarly tool in the 1870s. And it can be shown, I did so in an article a couple of years ago, that keyword indexes had absolutely no effect on scholarship whatsoever. In recent years, new technology has brought yet another return of this silly project of pouring all knowledge into a big garbage can and then providing feeble indexes with which to troll for results. This is, of course, a massive step down from the powerful subject indexing of the mid-20th century, and the declining quality of our scholarly production shows the result. Thus, my first two trends in knowing are a move towards a peculiar and limited form of algorithmic knowing among our young people, and the increasing dominance of a one-size-fits-all concept of scientific knowing among their elders. My third trend has already made its appearance, the phenomenal increase in knowing that is done not by us, but by machines. I must therefore say some home truths about computers. Let me first assure you, however, and I am neither a newcomer nor a naysayer about computers. I built a simple hardwire computer under my father's direction in 1960 at age 12. I learned Fortran at 18 in 1967, and I was applying string search algorithms to social data 35 years ago, long before Google existed. So here are some home truths. Modern computing has truly immense power. Now, to be sure, the theoretical foundations of the great modern algorithms are quite old. They date from the 1940s. But we now have the machines to apply these methods on a breathtaking scale. Two applications seem to me particularly salient. First, the Monte Carlo revolution, which enables us to simulate large systems in great detail and to estimate previously intractable Bayesian functional forms. And second, the search revolution that enables us to find very, very faint signals in extremely noisy or sparse spaces. I have myself published in both of these areas, and I appreciate these revolutions very, very much. But computers are not very good at imagination. Their power at chess, and now even at Go, rests mainly on brute force techniques rather than on imaginative ones. They're also bad at the associative knowledge of the kind characteristic of much human thought, and they make no use of emotion in thinking, which, oddly enough, may turn out to be a fatal flaw. But the successes of computers at producing a kind of highly regular, commodified knowledge have tended to push our conception of knowing towards the kinds of knowing at which computers are best. Probability-based simulation and search based on iterative rules laced with randomization at decisive places. To repeat an example I've used a couple of times before, many humanists expect great things from the digital humanities. But it's now more than 40 years since scholars discovered by computational methods the order in which Plato's dialogues were written. And it's more than 60 years since the works of Thomas Aquinas were keyword indexed. Yet neither of these discoveries has made the slightest impact on scholarship and reflection about Plato and St. Thomas, because the kinds of things discoverable about them by using digital methods are of no real interest to the humanities properly conceived. We don't care in what order Plato wrote the dialogues. We care what they mean. Computers will not tell us that. Now, the last and perhaps the most important of the changes in knowing is the decline of discursive, linearly ordered knowing as a practice. There are two causes of this change. Both have already made their appearance tonight. The first is the move towards a group knowing, a social knower, because this takes shape in oral or conversational forms. You know by having conversations. Our students spend enormous amounts of time in conversation even while they think they are studying. Even among serious scholars, we find blogs that are, in essence, hallway conversation. Now, I chat often in hallways myself, but I don't mistake that for serious inquiry. Yet many of my younger colleagues devote considerable time to broadcasting their hallway chatter, and their scholarly work inevitably takes on a similar quality. Now, perhaps this is not so bad. Orality is, after all, the basis of the internalized conversation, that is, thinking. Much more baleful is the shift towards visual knowing. This is a very long-standing change. Illustrations became more and more important as the 19th century passed through print forms, from the unillustrated reviews of the beginning of the century to the middle-class triple-decker novels with their multiple illustrations, to the penny novels and the illustrated news magazine. And then the 20th century brought the movies, and one has only to see even an excellent movie of a classic 19th century novel to realize the decline in the power of the art form. Movies have their own many and wonderful virtues, but those virtues are chiefly visual, not theoretical, and the subtle complexities of moral judgment, personal conflict, and social structure that undergird Anna Karenina disappear in the facile experience of seeing it as a movie in a few hours, rather than living with its microscopic details for the several weeks it takes to read the novel. Now, movies were, of course, followed by television and by the internet. There's no question that these are brilliant and extraordinary communication forms, and that they permit certain kinds of immediacy never before possible. But despite the claims of Edward Tufte, Visual representation does not effectively convey highly complex thought. And we would no more try to prove the fundamental theorem of the calculus with purely visual propositions than we would try to convey the moral ambiguities facing Hamlet without employing words. Visual knowing is simply not as powerful a tool of intellect as is discursive knowing. That's just a fact. Let me then summarize what I think are the major changes happening in knowing. This has been a long section. What we see in our children and students are a strong shift towards social knowing, knowing as finding, knowing as algorithm, and away from artisanal knowing, knowing as association, and knowing as discursive argument. More broadly, the great shifts are first, a shift towards computer-based knowing and its typical strengths, search and simulation, along with its emphasis on thinking via the routines of algorithms rather than by the networks of association. Second, a shift towards a one-size-fits-all model of knowing based on the model of science decisively rejected by the philosophers more than half a century ago. Third, a move towards a model of knowing as index and search, but in a situation where we have much larger masses of materials and far weaker indexes than we had before. Fourth, and finally, a move away from complex discursive thought that can be shared only through carefully composed and edited prose or formal symbolism, and towards the instantaneous facility of orality and visual representation. It's a sign of my faith in discursive presentation that I have not shown you any pictures, but have forced you to follow my argument, to try to memorize its pieces, to think my argument as you go along. I'm very sure you'll remember my argument much better and will take it much more seriously because I have forced you to think it yourselves rather than to just see it as a list of propositions up there on the screen. And I appreciate the hard work you've done in following my argument. That's why I have some more. Third section is to talk about the temporality of all these changes I've mentioned so far. The first step in putting these trends together is to recognize that they vary in their temporal qualities and their ability to be influenced or redirected by us. Some of these are trends, some are one-time events. Some of these things are reversible, some are not. With respect to the known, just to go back to the beginning, the objects of knowledge, I noted two changes, a move to social data and a move to microscopic detail. Of these two, the move to social data is a long-term, irrevocable trend. Although there's currently an attempt to dismantle the state data gathering that was so characteristic of the 20th century, it is more than offset by the astounding growth of commercial knowledge about the population. Now, on the other hand, the problem of microscopic detail is a matter of our own failure to invent intermediate conceptions that can conceptualize, assemble, and reflect about the hugely detailed knowledge that we now have. This is a temporary condition, and in reality, it's a welcome change to the maturing social sciences. With respect to the known, then, there is one irrevocable trend and one seeming trend that could be turned into a cycle by a serious intellectual response. Now, vis-a-vis the knower, the subject of knowing, I detailed three changes: the rise of social knowing, the importance of organizations as knowers, and the commodification of knowledge in things. Now, the first of these, the rise of social knowing, has its origins in the emergence of enormous complex problems of knowing, particularly problems of application, more than those of basic science. Quantum mechanics came from invisible colleges and disciplines, but the atom bomb was built by a large organization. Big science continued in peacetime because of similar practical complexities, and organizational knowing more broadly arises from the search for efficiency in mass application, as the modern hospital shows so well, or so badly. As for the placing of knowledge into commodities, this too began as a matter of efficiency and accuracy: slide rules, thermometers, computers, and so on. However, it is now driven by the profit motive because the capitalists have realized that while knowledge cannot be made into property in the minds of individuals, it can be made property when embodied in a physical artifact or in certain kinds of texts. All three of these changes, then, are driven by considerations largely external to the world of basic research in which we live. Technology, application, and capitalism are the main forces here. Now, of the three changes, social knowing is in part a reversible trend. As I noted earlier, it has been reversed before. In my own experience, even today, the best students prefer to work on their own as artisans. And there's no real proof that basic research, even in most of the natural sciences, much less in the humanities and humanistic social sciences, requires or is much helped by collective organization beyond invisible colleges and disciplines. So I believe that artisanal knowing can be preserved. As for the drift of knowledge into organizations and commodities, that is basically the result of capitalism and of the public preference for useful knowledge rather than foundational knowledge. These things cannot be affected by any response among academics and intellectuals, other than showing our students the many ways that Google searches are much less effective than were the equivalent searches in the much higher quality print indexes. In short, of the three changes in the knower, only social knowing can be slowed. The increasing importance of organizational and commodity knowing is inevitable. Now to turn to the result of knowing, knowledge itself. I talked mainly about the embodying of knowledge in patentable commodities and the trend towards believing first that knowledge is made up of commodities, and second, that to have knowledge is a form of possession rather than a form of activity. I think this trend towards a capitalist conception of knowledge is irrevocable for the moment, at least within the universities. Because the universities have moved from the periphery to the center of their societies in the last century, the intellectual life that once found a home in them is being pushed aside for two other functions. First, certifying young people for employment, and second, inventing things or services that can produce income or solve problems. As a result, the institutions of disinterested intellectual life could very well move out of universities in the near future. Real intellectual activity can neither endure nor survive the neoliberal management that drives modern capitalism. I'm quite serious about this prediction. The love affair between intellectualism and the universities, about 100 plus years old, but it's going through a very difficult time, and divorce may come very soon. Let me talk finally about the changes in knowing, the activity. The move towards algorithmic rather than associative thinking, and the idea that all knowing is scientific knowing, these are in fact recurrent episodes in the history of knowledge in the 20th century. In the US, for example, scientism of this sort had a vogue in the 19-teens, in the late 1930s and the war years, after Sputnik, and since the 1990s. But such episodes of scientism are always succeeded by successful recasting of the social sciences and humanities into non-scientific terms. For example, social physics, which we see today in network analysis, has come and gone at least 3 times since it was first argued in the 19th century. Or again, most of the big data techniques so fashionable today are at least half a century old. Cluster analysis, factor analysis, multidimensional scaling, Monte Carlo simulation, simulated annealing, and so on. When they were first invented, it was quickly discovered that they don't provide answers that scholars actually believe. And so many of them were left to the market researchers who have lower standards, although a few of them did eventually find useful homes in scientific analysis. Now, by contrast, the move towards imagining knowing as a matter of index, search, and assemble, the Google program, is, as I noted, a century-old program long rejected by scholars. But it has, however, taken the scholars by storm in the last 20 years, in part because the scholars themselves have been so woefully inadequate in coming up with answers to the other challenges that I have talked about. I do think this trend can be halted if our colleagues wake up to the challenge, which they may do once they get past their initial blind enthusiasm for things digital. Much more important, however, the move from discursive to visual symbols has been underway for well over a century, and it looks likely to continue for the foreseeable future. This last is a central problem for expert knowing, because knowing has been founded on complex discursive argument for at least 5 centuries in the West, dating back to the coming of print. And yet our students are woefully unprepared to deal with complex argument, because they simply don't have the immense print experience that's been characteristic of societies since the rise of general literacy in the 19th century. This is an example of one of those long-term trends that we cannot possibly influence. We must simply take account of it, and we must adjust our teaching to the challenges that it presents. To summarize in terms of time horizon, then, certain trends seem long, steady, and irrevocable. These are the move towards increasing knowledge of the social, the move towards organization and commodities as knowers because of the immense efficiencies involved, the move, particularly among young people, towards a conception of knowledge as discrete commodities, in part because of the capitalist interest in commodification, but more because it's inculcated by the internet. And fourth, the move from discursive knowing to visual and oral knowing, because visual and oral knowing are easier, more popular, perhaps more democratic because they demand less, and because the change has been underway for at least 150 plus years. That this shift is a decline in terms of abstract reasoning and thought seems to be invisible to all too many intellectuals who are caught up with the mania for visualization, which, if you've actually worked with it, is a very two-edged sword indeed. But the combination of inevitability and importance means that we must address this change head-on. It requires serious remedial work with BA and doctoral students, whom we take to be candidates to be our successors. So those are the irrevocable changes. What are the things that are trends that we might actually affect? First, we might change the drive of social knowledge towards microscopic detail and our consequent inability to theorize. Those things can be addressed by serious theoretical work and the invention of new kinds of intermediate conceptions. Second, we can address much of the drift to social and collective knowing, which is mainly driven by desertion of basic research for applied research. We can do that by turning back to basic research and ignoring both the blandishments and the punishments of external interest. Third, I think we can address the tendency of science to impose itself as a one-size-fits-all model for knowing. This argument is always self-limiting because, with few exceptions, even the most hardened scientizers can see that human life inevitably involves morality, legality, beauty, and other non-scientifically conceivable qualities. Amusingly, among those who cannot understand this fact are the law and economics ideologues of my own university's law school. Fourth, I think we can address the current tendency to treat all knowing as possible through index and search, to treat all knowing as algorithmic. I think that too is self-limiting. Associative knowing is extremely powerful, and as yet computers have no skill for it. By formally conceptualizing the different but equally important excellences of associative reasoning, we can effectively push this particular pendulum back the other way. Thus, there are inevitabilities and there are cycles. But beyond the inevitability and the cycles are aspects of the current crisis that are simply one-time problems. The most obvious of these is the failure of the human and social sciences to develop serious new tools to make sense out of the excess of things to know, which is surely just a temporary problem occasioned by the onslaught of information from the new data machines. Thus, we see that the mix of inevitabilities, of cyclical phenomena, and of one-time events requires that we devote our energy to the cycles, not to the inevitabilities which we can affect, and that we must make sure that real experts are the judges of what works as knowledge and what does not work. But I wish to close by arguing that there is behind our current situation a deeper one-time problem. This is my closing section. I believe that the real reason all these other trends and cycles cause problems in contemporary expert knowing is that they threaten us at a moment when our own internal history has reached a turning point. The last 20 years have seen the culmination of the previous strategy undergirding our expert knowledge institutions in the modern world, the culmination of what I shall call the 20th century knowledge project. That is, I think that a great knowledge project was conceived in the last years of the 19th century and then was co-developed with the universities throughout the 20th. I think that project was a massive success, a success we see in the tens of thousands of brilliant books produced by the world's scholars under this regime of knowledge, and by the astonishing burst of basic science that opened the gates of so many areas, requiring enough elaboration and sustaining enough applications to preoccupy us all for many decades to come. Now, this 20th century project was not the project of Leopold von Ranke or Louis Pasteur or James Bryce. 19th century knowledge was something different. And indeed, the great 19th century scholars might well have thought that our 20th century project was a step down from the high standards and perfected rigor that they so much valued. But whatever they might have thought, I think that the 20th century project has been a wild success. The trouble is that it's over. We have done what we can do under the regime of knowing that we have had. And the drift of smart young people off to the world of application, to Google research, to the business world, is a sign that we are no longer interesting enough to command the best minds of the new generations. Thus, the very culmination of our own project leaves us wondering what to do next, at a moment when, as it happens, the external world has threatened many aspects of the social structure and cultural practices that have sustained our work so well for so many years. Now, I shall tell this story mainly as it applies to the humanities and social sciences, although I think it can work with a few changes for the natural sciences as well. I also tell it basically as an American story, for I think it is unquestionable that the American universities dominated the academic world for the entire 20th century. Let me remind you of the origins of modern American academia. After the American Civil War, many Americans made the trek to the German and French universities for advanced education, much as the Chinese are trekking to America today. On their return, they realized that the American university, whether it was a small private school producing clergymen or a brand new state university designed to advance learning for the general population, they realized that those would need a complete transformation to become serious institutions. They created that new institution by grafting a German top onto an English bottom, marrying specialist education for graduate students to generalist education for undergraduates. In the process, they democratized the German Research Institute into the departmental band of equals, and they loosened the then new English specialized honors curriculum into a combination of general education and a departmental major. This undergraduate curriculum was loosely organized around an English-style canon of material. But the German top of the American university required PhD work by would-be faculty. And this meant that the new young scholars turned, on the one hand, to the investigation of the humanistic canon, and on the other, to the creation of an equivalent and more empirical social science canon, also largely organized around canonical or canonizable areas like political and social theory, national and period history, and cross-cultural comparison. Now, the American universities expanded more or less exponentially from 1890 to 1975, with short breathers during the First World War and the Depression and the Second World War. Like all exponentially expanding populations, faculty were young on average. The system was accordingly creative, hopeful, upbeat. After 1975, however, demographic crisis set in. Expansion of the system stopped, the faculty rapidly aged, and the new system had as many senior scholars as it had assistant professors. As I showed in a recent article, this demographic change touched off the academia-wide decrease in reading and increase in writing that are commonly and to a large extent erroneously attributed to neoliberal management. But more important, the end of expansion turned the academic market from a seller's market to a buyer's market, leading to the explosive expansion of unimportant publication that we observe today, which in turn has made it harder to read systematically and so has furthered the decline of knowing. That is, many of the things that are considered to be part of the grand crisis in American academia today are in fact simple consequences of the social structure that was produced by the inevitable end of American academic expansion. Even more important to the crisis was the fact that the exponential expansion had burned up dissertation topics faster than a wildfire burns up forests. There were 40 dissertations on Jane Austen by 1963 and several hundred on Shakespeare. Indeed, the rise of identity politics as legitimate dissertation topics may well have been just an attempt to find new dissertation topics. By rejecting all prior scholarship as biased, one could begin again. One could reinvent the whole thing from scratch, this time taking seriously women or blacks or Latinos or homosexuals or whoever it was you were interested in. This bought the American humanities and social sciences perhaps another 30 years of dissertation research. But the problem with this identity politics strategy were several. For one thing, it made the non-cumulative nature of the humanities and social sciences all too evident at a time when science was waxing strong. For another, it allowed intense politicization and established ad hominem and anachronistic arguments as legitimate, and thereby undercut core legitimacies of intellectual life. Third, it distracted scholars from the merely postponed problem of inventing some new form of knowing now that the 20th century project was reaching culmination. More broadly, this strategy concealed from American academics the nature and price of their 20th century success. They had created an extraordinary organization, to be sure, but much of its greatness lay in its perpetual growth. And when that growth inevitably stopped, the whole system stopped with it. American academia was, in effect, a Ponzi scheme. Moreover, the university became so successful as an institution that society began to rely on it as a machine to evaluate the nation's young, which of necessity imposed standards inimical to academic life. Obvious example being the grade inflation that pervades elite academic education in America. But if the price of success was that the society expected the university to do all things for all people, the more profound problem was internal. By 2000, academia had reached the end of the knowledge project founded on canonical thinking, mastery of basics, and research that was related to canonical topics and tied to disciplinary organization. It had done what it had set out to do, and its record, the collective product of American universities in the 20th century, is indeed an astonishing and masterful whole. But it was also in the past tense. No one can read more than a tiny fraction of it, and the synthetic tools and problematics that could organize academia around such a common knowledge project are gone today. The mixture of canons and digest that had sustained the loose coherence of disciplines eventually simply fell apart. Economics circled the wagons around its canon, but thereby degenerated into a form of engineering. Anthropology rejected its founding fathers and found out that it really wasn't about anything. History degenerated into squabbles over who was more oppressed than whom. I could go on. The fact of the matter is that by 2000, the 20th century knowledge project was all played out, and the strategy that had extended its life for a couple of decades after 1980 actually killed it in the end. To put the matter simply, we are at a moment where we must invent a new way of being academic intellectuals. It's not clear what that will be, only that the old way is at an end. Our scholarly communications consist mainly of unimportant make work. Our managers are rewarding flash rather than substance. Our research tools have descended to the level of worthless keyword searches. Our peer review system is weakened to the point of being cursory. Many of our disciplinary associations have degenerated into soft-core political associations. The disciplines themselves are under systematic attack by administrators and by colleagues who wish to forsake the disciplines for interdisciplines and centers. Self-publishing has become a major and even an approved practice. Undergraduate students are seducing us in the name of relevance and openness into teaching that is both lazy and ineffective. Now, most of these things are not so much the signs of decline as they are signs of success. We have accomplished what our predecessors set out to do a century or more ago. We have covered the Western canon with careful scholarly inquiry. We have done thousands of studies of everyday social life and comparative politics and symbolic practices and so on. What we have not done is to rethink all this, digest it, and use it to formulate a new kind of knowing that can go forward and command the minds of our very best young people. That they themselves probably cannot undertake that task under the precarious conditions of current academic employment is no doubt true. Only a very bold mind will buck the trend to fashionability and flash. Given that that is the case, it's up to us who are already in the system to figure out the new way to shape the knowing of the future. And there is certainly excitement at hand, given the fact that academia will, in the next 40 years, need to come to terms with the vast new university systems of India and China, and more broadly with the growth of the world of knowledge as it spreads to societies that are far from Western thought in their outlook on life. And the very knowledge trends that I have listed present in themselves an enormous intellectual challenge. Much of my own work trying to theorize the nature of humanistic knowledge has come from fighting battles over our university's library, over new kinds of research, and so on. And indeed, perhaps the academic knower of the future will need to be a non-specialist, as I am. Someone who can, if I can paraphrase Mark, do mathematical sociology in the morning, ethnography at midday, archival analysis in the afternoon, and critique in the evening. That kind of multi-skill could be the basis of a whole new kind of intellectual order. Of course, it could also be just self-indulgent nonsense, but there it is. The main fact is that the project we have been doing is probably over, and it's over at a time when we are under severe threat from outside. It is therefore a time for profound reflection and for decisive action. Above all, it's a time for imagination. Otherwise, the kind of knowing to which many of us have given our lives will simply disappear over the next 30 or 40 years.
Okay, well, perhaps I can start. Professor Abbott, could you perhaps summarize how the trends that you outlined will, in the next few years, change the social sciences?
Well, is this thing recording? What am I supposed to do? Do it again?
Press it again. What?
There we are. There we are. Thank you. You know, I guess if I knew the answer to that question, I would have written it already, and but I don't. So I'm working on it right now. So my really major book at present is an attempt to refound all of the social sciences on the concept of process, which in a certain way is to attack the basic 19th century concept at the heart of the social sciences, which is historicism. So I figured that if I could gin up a whole way of thinking about the world that's anti-historicist, that would give people stuff to work on for a while. Other people may be doing other things that are equally complex. That's the level on which those of us who are able need to think. I genuinely believe this argument that kind of there was a thing that we did in the 20th century and that it's kind of done. That's at the heart of the knowledge book that I'm writing. And I think that we're in a new world. This world is very different. The kinds of knowing that exist in it are very different. The problematics have to be different. So it's not a time for minor wrinkles. It's a time for bold thinking and really radical change. Because otherwise we're just going to sit here going through the motions and producing meaningless little articles. You know, in the period of the mid-20th century, before the buyer's market emerged, the average American academic wrote 2 or 3 papers in a lifetime. Now, what that meant was they had a lot of time to read, and there wasn't anywhere near as much to read. Now we write 2 or 3 papers, not quite a month, but for most of it, it'd be a small amount for a year. There's just too much to read. The whole system is premised on a different kind of availability of time. It really was a Ponzi scheme, and it can't, the structure of academics that we have set up cannot continue functioning outside the Ponzi context. So who knows? Who knows what will happen? The whole thing could move outside the universities and build from little tiny organizations up again, and then it would be able, that's another Ponzi scheme, right? You get rid of the old Ponzi scheme and you start a new one, which will be better. I have no idea whether this is answering your question or not, but...
Oh, yes, it is. We have another question, I think in the second row, Michael Hutter.
Well, thanks a lot for this incredibly rich presentation. And although you say that not having visual aids is an aid to us, I'm not so convinced because unless I read the stuff, my memory is taxed. So just one point where I would like some clarification. Visual knowledge, you were rather negative on it, and the example you gave was Anna Karenina and Hamlet, which, as we know, are texts written in words. Now, what about forms of knowledge that are created on the visual plane, meaning movies like Rashomon or High Noon or maybe Star Wars, where anything literary would be secondary to it. So as you also speak for emotion as a form of knowing, wouldn't that release another dimension of knowing rather than being just a small copy of it?
There's no question that you know, the purely visual worlds for purely visual arts have their own absolutely wonderful internal logic. So, you know, if we look at the history of painting, you see how basically generations of painters are commenting on previous painters' views of the world. It's clear that one can do that. The danger that I'm seeing, of course, you argue only against the dangers, not against other stuff you take for granted. The danger that I see among the students is that my students, the young ones, really want a picture of anything before they can understand, they think, even an argument. And they don't seem to have been taught geometry the way one was taught geometry when the purpose of learning it was not the pictures, but the method of proof. They don't have, the students who are coming into my classes don't have that grasp of proof structure and so on. So I think that my brief against visualization, it's a bit of a rant, but I certainly don't want to in any way suggest that knowing or thought that in some sense is fundamentally visual should somehow be represented in words. That's crazy. It doesn't work very well. There are situations in which the picture is worth 1,000 words, but the moral arguments of Anna Karenina are not an example of that. Now, maybe Anna Karenina's beauty is, but on the other hand, since canons of beauty change from time to time, then you're encoding a particular whatever. But, you know, in the future, it could easily be the case that we could design a movie of Anna Karenina that would be directly clued into current fashion styles, and so the costumes would be continually redone. You could watch the movie again, or you could watch a 1920s version, a 1930s version, and just all that. Somebody will figure out how to do that. It's fun. So I don't mean to say that visual thinking is not important or useful. I mean, no, I'm a Go player, and nobody would think about playing Go without having that knowledge. The danger is the loss of the power of discursive argument, which I really see in students, just in their papers, in their work, and in the notion that they can read Adam Smith and not see that the argument has a logical structure. And these are very smart kids from the best high schools in America. They simply don't have that.
Thank you. We have two more questions. One far back, and the other here on the right side.
Thank you, Professor Abbott, for a very provocative lecture. So I guess I would consider myself of being a member of the group of the younger kind of emerging scholars who have been, I guess, infected by this contagion of visual indexed social knowing. And in your lecture, you direct this critique to one might say the old guard of people who've already made it in academia, and you leave it to them to kind of reinvent a new way of knowing to make the university relevant again. And I'm wondering then where my role might be in that.
I think, you know, your role will be fine. In the first place, you know, we're going to be dead pretty soon. So the great thing, really great thing about academia is you don't have to defeat the arguments of older people. It's Max Planck, right, who says science advances one funeral at a time. So you don't have to worry. You'll take over automatically because we'll be gone. Obviously, there are students who still have wonderful discursive skills. I do have students who do nothing but read. There are plenty of people who have this. Often people who have profound training in mathematics are people who can move it quickly into other sorts of areas, can do extremely difficult argument because of that. Unfortunately, for example, in sociology, we're losing all those people who are going to economics. So we need the mathematicians, although it's a certain kind of mathematician, a mathematician with an imagination that you need. So of course, there are tons of people in the younger generation. I've now sat on 102 dissertation committees, and they're smart young people who have wonderful skills and ability. There's plenty of people to come after us to do it. I do think that, you know, the job of turning out the lights and pointing the way to the new house, that's kind of is up to us. That's what I'm trying to do in this thing by talking about a 20th century project. That has to be much elaborated chapter in the book, clearly. But of course, young people of the future, not us.
Thank you.
Thanks for your lecture. I work at a German funding agency, and I was wondering if all scientists suddenly see how rotten this entire mass production of publications is, and they will stop writing papers. How are we supposed to know who's worth to be funded? Like, who will we give our funding to if we have to wait 50 years until you will publish your first publication, and then we'll see, only then we'll see if you're brilliant or just pretending?
Well, you know, let's put it this way. So there are several things to say in response to that. First of all, people could cut their publication rate by 80%, and you would still have plenty enough stuff to judge on. So for example, if you look at Britain, the move they've taken from the RAE to the REF, the Research Excellence Framework, they are now insisting on seeing only 4 pieces from each individual instead of everything they've ever dreamed or thought or, you know, written down. There's a long ways to go before you're going to be in trouble for stuff to judge. I think a second problem, a second and much more subtle problem with the argument is that none of us actually knows what's going to be great in 5 years, much less what's going to be great in 25 years. After all, what did Albert Einstein win the Nobel Prize for? Anybody in this room remember? It's a couple of papers on temperature. He didn't win the Nobel Prize for relativity. Now, you could argue that winning the prize for the papers on temperature was an indicator. And so you fund him and he'll invent relativity. Well, I don't know. It's not sure. The reason the disciplinary mechanism and the departmental mechanism worked so well, it seems to me, for the 20th century project is that in a department you had a bunch of people who were at risk of becoming great. And only 1 or 2 of them would pan out. But 1 or 2 is what you need. Look at my own, my colleagues in the economics department at the University of Chicago. A wonderful, truly distinguished department, a little caricatured today. But it's deep down a department that has lived off the contributions of about 6 people over the last 80 years. Essentially Frank Knight, Schultz, Milton Friedman, George Stigler, Gary Becker, Bob Lucas. It's not bad. The reason you had all those other people in the department whose names you don't know, but I could recite them all, you know, Lester Telser and D. Gale Johnson and blah, blah. The reason you have all those other people is that, well, sometimes it pans out and sometimes it doesn't. So I think the difficulty for funders is you're looking for something that's, you know, a howling success, and there is no way to know that ahead of time. And of course, it's also driven in part by the fact, I'm sorry to put you on the spot, but as my first dissertation student showed, people who are officers for funding operations have themselves careers to make, and their careers are made by having bets that pay off pretty quickly. So they have a whole interest in funding new research because nobody wants to fund old research because you can't identify it with you. So one of the great problems of the way the funding system works, at least in the United States, is that there's an enormous amount of churn to it, because the real way you make great academic knowledge is to just give a bunch of people a pile of money and lock them in a room and say, don't come out until you've done some interesting things. That's the Bell Labs model, and that was funded by a national monopoly, essentially. So it was part of the consent decree that gave AT&T a monopoly of telephony in the 1930s, that they would spend, I think, 2% of gross profits on research. Now, Bell Labs is the source of half the technology that drives the entire world. In fact, of course, because it's the source of the transistor, it's the source of the one invention that makes everything that we now do possible. But nobody knew, oh, this guy, Bill Shockley, he's going to do it. He's going to figure it out. We're going to fund him. No, Shockley was one of many people. They all ran into each other, and the idea of the transistor cooked up basically one day at lunch. That's what you do. You have to just throw money at people in a sandbox. Now, it's pretty hard to tell a society that's desperate for money for health and welfare and roads and infrastructure and blah, 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 blah. Well, you just give money to these guys and let them kind of play. But in fact, that's what produced what happened between 1870 and 1950. And, you know, we're a bunch of footnotes to that, basically. But that's what it took. It just takes this kind of, that kind of system. It's not clear to me that that's going to happen. Intellectuals are always looking for a free ride. That's no question. And they go where the money is. That's why the young people are going to Google now, because there's a ton of cash at Google. I mean, they're just idiots. I have some friends who work there. But you know, you got that much money, eventually some really smart people are going to show up and they're going to do some really exciting things, and it's going to happen. So if you look, one of the chapters of the book I'm writing is essentially an ecological history of where the intellectuals have been. Because they weren't always in the universities in the United States. The mid-19th century, there's no intellectuals in universities to speak of at all. You know, there's a few people at Harvard and a few other places. But mainly intellectuals in those days were on the lecture circuit, the Lyceum circuit. They were eventually in Chautauqua. They're basically going around the country giving thousands of lectures where they basically charged by the seat, the sort of privatdocenten system kind of. And then there's actually much of intellectual life in the 19th century in the United States was essentially funded by the Protestant churches, because they had all these clergymen who were highly educated people and who didn't have enough to do, and they became the backbone of ichthyology and herpetology and all these botanical and biological areas. They were the backbone of variable star astronomy, for example. These guys, they're all clergymen. If you read the old textbooks of you know, A Field Guide to the Heavens, 1905, it's just filled with religious symbolism, because it was all clergymen who were doing this work. It's quite astonishing. So, you know, the funders have, I sympathize with your problem. And this is one of the reasons I myself have always tried to do cheap research. It's too much of a hassle to write grant reports. I don't function well that way, so.
All right, thank you. With one question there.
Yeah. I'm interested if it helps to distinguish between like a sociological history of knowledge and, of course, the structures who make it possible, especially university, and the images those systems and the people like to have of themselves. So I had this feeling like this associative thinking is, of course, part of the image of university, an image of intellectualism. And I mean, you've described yourself how the structures who made it possible have changed. My feeling is that sometimes I feel like those structures were more important than what was possible with it. Which I mean by this, the structure of university has changed. You described all the structural changes, and it seems like nothing is left of this thinking. So I feel like this style of thinking is not very strong at the moment. It seems like it was kind of a luxury thing people could do. I mean, this is, of course, you said it yourself, part of it that not a lot of people did it. And of course, there was like a division of power in the society between between the different actors, and science with a big a capital S, of course, had its role there of an authoritarian knowledge. And yeah, my question is, why is it so bad that this changes? Maybe some of the images that were existent until recently were just images.
Well, there's sort of several different things in there. I guess let me just identify two of them. So the first one is the concept of associative knowing. I actually think this is a pretty important concept. And it's something that there's no theory of in information science that I can see at all. You know, when I look at a text of Adam Smith, the entire text is blue with hyperlinks. That's because the hyperlinks are in my mind. I see certain words and I say, oh yeah, Hobbes said that. Oh yeah, oh yeah, oh yeah. And that's because the stuff is in my head. There's no model for that in information science where they talk about how a group of people who process texts that way can function. So I actually think that's a pretty important, in many ways, that's the central, sort of new conceptual concept in this talk, is this notion of associative knowing as a kind of knowing. Now, I mean, you really run across this when you are trying to teach a text like The Wealth of Nations to 18-year-olds who don't have anything like the stuff you have in your head. And it's very hard for you to figure out what it is that they are reading. What is the experience they are having as they read? Now, we all had this experience when we read The Wealth of Nations for the first time. And what's interesting is that in the actual writing style of canonical scholarship of that sort, there were particular ways in which you suggested to the reader, this is something you need to look up. Now, one of the ways you did that was you referred to Hobbes. You didn't say Thomas Hobbes. You just referred to Hobbes, and the person would say, oh, there's no first name. No first name means I'm supposed to know who this is. And, of course, nowadays you could, of course, go off to the internet and find out who old Tommy Hobbes was, but you used to just go to encyclopedia or make a note. I think that it's pretty essential to realize that in most cases, serious thought does require presence in the central processing unit of a large body of related information which is going to be brought into the process. There's just no thinking about this in this kind of straight-out algorithms way of approaching thought. So that's that issue. So I think that's pretty important. Now, I wasn't quite clear about all the things you were saying in the second half, or the second part of your comment. There's no question that the stuff that was invented by the 20th century project, like the stuff that was just invented by the 19th century project, was often put to some pretty dire uses. After all, classical scholarship emerged in great strength in this country and then was absolutely central to the nationalist projects of the Second Reich. So, and we know that these, and in fact, that's where much of the money came from, was to produce this kind of stuff. I'm not trying to make any claim that there's something fundamentally moral or one way or another about knowledge, what we might call knowledge for itself. I do actually think that in the social sciences, one of the big changes we have to face is that we have to get quite serious about dealing with the problem that all social knowledge inevitably involves values. And I don't want to say this in some sort of debunking kind of way, the way the Edinburgh School was busy debunking, scientific norms of Robert Merton. The man who separated fact and value, of course, is the greatest philosopher of this country. And Kant tried to put them back together again in the third critique and didn't quite succeed, and we're basically all trying to do that. I do think that's one of the fundamental things the social sciences have to do in the next 50 years. So this comes to your point. And that is something that I am definitely making central in my own work in the next few years. So I'm also, for example, arguing that sociology should acquire a normative subdiscipline that does the same thing for sociology that political theory does for the field of politics. It's not clear to me how that normative field should be organized, but I think we have to especially in the United States, we have to deal with the kind of crazinesses of politicization by creating some form of responsible normative inquiry. Now, whether it's going to take the form of commentary on a canon, which is the way political theory works, or whether it'll take the form, some sort of form that looks like English common law, where people get a whole bunch of books together and say, here are 10 books on household division of labor. What theory of morality was applied in this book, and theory in this book, and theory in this book, and then what is the best idea of a concept of morality for thinking about the family division of labor? So it seems to me we could have a discipline that worked like that, but I think the fact that the social sciences are fundamentally involved in a valued and political enterprise has to be accepted and I don't want to say methodologized. It has to be dealt with as a fundamental condition of the kind of work we do, in which you don't have, as we have in the United States, just openly political stuff. That's essentially a fair amount of scholarship that's simply in favor of this or that particular group that the writer favors. Well, that's fine, but you know, there is a more disciplined way of thinking about that, and historically it's been characteristic of legal systems. In that sense, you know, it pushes us back to Max Weber, which is kind of strange because it's Weber who says that, you know, we can think of Wissenschaft als Beruf, we can think about separating Wissenschaft als Beruf and Politik als Beruf, we can have separate facts and values, but Weber himself, in fact, got much of his theoretical armament from von Jhering. And Jhering was a legal theorist, a historian of jurisprudence and of juridical systems. So it's kind of interesting that Weber, who starts out from this strong legal background, ends up writing about how separately we're going to treat facts and values. It's a very sort of neo-Kantian position, I realize, but I do think that the frank recognition of the value aspects of the social sciences and the open embrace of that in some disciplined and rigorous fashion, for which the law gives us an example, I think that's a necessity in the next 50 years in the social sciences.
Thank you. We have time for one short question and one short response, please.
Okay, well,
somebody asked me a question and says yes or no.
well, my question actually goes to understanding your argument, particularly about these two trends that you were talking about as irreversible, the rise of the social knowledge and also the organizational sort of form of knowledge, which particularly with the latter you say it's basically due to efficiency pressures. And you also say that it's inimical to basically both discursive and associational knowledge. And I was just wondering about that because I would have thought that both discursive and associational knowledge are inherently collaborative and conversational. So by emphasizing the sort of the efficiency explanation for the rise of organizational knowledge, are you not kind of, you know, omitting this this other reason which you might be more sympathetic to?
Yes, I am, but that's because I was beginning to worry about time. And so when I gave that summary, I skipped that part of that sentence, as it happens. It's a kind of cheap answer, but that's in fact what was going on. As you know, I hope you all realize this is essentially, the talk is meant to be a provocation. There's a lot of serious facts and analysis behind it, but you know, I'm too old to be polite anymore. So it's time to, you know, take these issues on. So in any case, thanks for these questions. They're very helpful and interesting.
Thank you very much. Thank you all. Thank you. Thank you all for being here. Thank you, Andrew Abbott. We will have a small reception outside, but before you go to the reception, you could Google out, for example, our network's website, www.sociologyofsociology.com, or you could follow us on Twitter. I don't know who feeds, actually, our Twitter account. I don't know. Someone does. So if you want to know who we are, what we do, and what our conferences are about, Google us. And see you later at the reception. Thank you.